Hi, good afternoon, dear all. It's great to see you again after a short BRIAS Easter spring break. On behalf of the entire BRIAS team, welcome back and welcome to our Big Ideas for Democracy lecture today. And this week, the spotlight is on Senior Fellow Professor Luana Russo, who is here in front. So Luana Russo is Associate Professor in Political Behavior and Quantitative Methods at Maastricht University, where she currently also serves as co-director of the Center for European Research in Maastricht, so CERIM. She obtained her PhD in political science in 2011 from Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna in Pisa with a thesis on electoral geography. She also has a lot of international experience. During her PhD studies, Luana was a visiting scholar at Columbia University and at the European University Institute in Florence. And following her PhD, she also held postdoctoral positions at Sciences Po Paris and Université Lille 2, both in France, obviously. Professor Russo is an expert in the study of elections, political attitudes and behaviors, political psychology, effective polarization, and negative partisanship. She is dedicated to understanding how individuals form and express their political preferences, social identities, and affiliations, particularly within the context of political polarization. And her work has been distinguished various times. Only last month, her article on mainstream partisans' effective responses to non-cooperation with populist radical right parties, co-authored with Paula Schulz-Brock and published in the journal West European Politics, won the 2025 Justice Klingemann Prize for the best CSES, so Comparative Study of Electoral Systems, scholarship. Congratulations also on that again, Luana. In addition, Professor Russo is also actively involved in various research networks. She is currently a member of the executive committee of the ECPR and both founder and chair of the ECPR's Effective Polarization Standing Group. Today, Professor Luana Russo will present her big ideas on the topic of political identity as a feature of democracy, belonging, rejection, and absence. As usual, the lecture will take around 40 to 45 minutes, and then there's, again, plenty of time for a Q&A with the audience. So, Professor Russo, dear Luana, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here. I also want to thank BRIAS and especially the directors of these two-year programs, Emilie and Silvia, for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor. What I want to talk to you about today, it's indeed the concept of political identity. And before we start, please indulge me for a couple of minutes for something very non-academic, which is a personal anecdote. I was raised in a very political family. It was very clear to me who my parents were politically and how important that political identity was for them, and it's something that I socialized it at a very early age. We talked about politics at every dinner, basically, and we watched exit polls with the same passion that you can imagine Italians watching footballs. And there were plenty of exit polls because Italy in the 90s, it was basically pure instability. So we had basically one election per year. That was very exciting. This setting also matched a broader setting, the Italian one, in which people talk about their political affiliation, their political identity, their political preferences in a very liberal way. Italians engage in talks before elections about who they're going to vote for, what they voted for, and why. So you have an idea of who everybody is politically in a certain sense. And, well, fast forward, I moved to Belgium, I marry a Belgian, I become a Belgian, I can vote at Belgian elections. And at the last federal elections, our oldest son, he was 8, asked us when we exited the ballot box who we voted for, which party we voted for. And my Belgian husband was very reluctant to share that information because Belgians have a completely different set of rules about that. And he was really afraid, and I would have to say with some reasons, that our son would share that information with his classmates. And so all the parents would know what we voted for. And I really remember this. We were in the car, and I had a quite temperamental reaction to this. And I was like, oh, are you kidding me? We have to tell him what we voted for. How is he going to know who we are otherwise? This very deep sense of who we are, what we committed to through the party we vote to, it's something that has been thought very long in political science. it's decades we're thinking about that. And there is very large body of literature that actually engages in trying to understand to what extent citizens see politics as part of who they are. And we know that this shapes the way engage with the political world, the way relate to fellow citizens, and also how well democracy functions. We also know, thanks to this literature, that when you have too little political identity, you will have a population who is less likely to vote and who's going to engage way less in civic life. And this is likely to give you a problem with legitimacy. We also know from the more recent literature, the last 2 decades especially, that too much or too rigid political identity are going to probably lead to hostility towards outgroup and to high levels of affective polarization. And this also has the potential to weaken democratic norms and to damage the social fabric. What I just said about this, however, are consequences of political identity. And what I want to focus on today, it's actually the step before this. And it is, what is political identity? How do we think about political identity? And there is really a vast literature on this, and I didn't want to stop at the discipline in which I feel the most at ease, which is political science. So here I have an overview of 3 disciplines in social science, political science, social psychology, and political theory. Since there are people for all these disciplines in this room, chances are I'm going to upset everybody. But bear with me with this. It's going to be just a bit of a summary, but I think you are going to see why it's important to look at these 3 disciplines in particular. I'll start with political science for chronological reasons. Political science engages with the concept of political identity the way we think now about this already in the 60s. This is in the seminal work of Campbell and his colleagues, the Michigan School, and it's very early engagement with the topic per se, but it's mostly thought as party identification. And party identification, it is a central organizing concept of voting research, and it's defined as a durable psychological attachment to political party, and it's formed through early socialization, and it's resistant to short-term political fluctuations. So from the outset, the concept carried an implicit identity theoretic commitments. Voters were said to see themselves as Democrats or Republicans the same way they were to see themselves as Catholic or members of an union. But as I was saying, this is an implicit identity theoretic commitment because the way in which political science at that time engaged with the concept was operationalization. It's asking questions, it's empirical research. So the engagement with the concept was at very little an implicit theory and a lot of empirical force. That actually worked incredibly well because actually in this super famous book, The American Voter, Campbell and his colleagues managed to find many important correlations and to explain socialization in the American voter in a pretty compelling way. Yet, even later, the Michigan School did not develop this commitment into a full theory of identity. So in this sense, the measurement definitely preceded the theorization. Then we go to social psychology. This is much later. This is almost 2 decades later. It's end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And this is one important caveat here is that social psychology doesn't engage with party idea or political identity per se. They engage with social identity. And political identity is one of the social identity a person can have. And the interesting thing here is that this is the most developed theory of group-based identity. It's called the social identity theory. Was developed by Teffel and Turner in late 70s and beginning of the 80s. And according to this theory, individuals derive part of their self-concept from their membership to social groups. And they are motivated to maintain a positive evaluation of those groups relative to other groups, of course. In this case, the theory identifies basically 3 interrelated psychological processes. The first one, it's social categorization, and it's mostly the cognitive aspect of it. It's how to organize the world into social groups. Then we have social identification, which is the incorporation of the group membership into the self-concept that you have of yourself. And then there is social comparison, and this is an evaluative component. So it's how one sees its group relative to the other groups. In this theory, out-group derogation and in-group favoritism are not pathological deviations, but are simple consequences of thinking in these terms. And then we have political theory. And you're going to see there are many overlapping broad concepts with social psychology. It's also remarkable that the author, Pizzorno, that I'm going to talk the most about now, thinks of this theory basically at the same time of Teffel and Turner. So basically political theory and social psychology are contemporary in this sense, while political science was 2 decades before this. Well, political theory approached identity as a theoretical problem concerning the condition under which individuals become political actors at all. And there are many authors. I actually picked Pizzorno in this case because I thought that he really could talk to social identity theory very well. Actually, his point of departure is a critique to the rational choice theory. Because, well, rational choice theory starts from the assumptions that political actors enter the political arena with preformed and stable preferences. And Pizzorno completely disagrees with this. He says, no, it's actually the other way around. Preferences are not prior to the identity, but are constituted by the identity. And he argues that before individuals can know what they want from politics, they must know who they are. They must know who they are as political actor, to which community they belong, the struggles that they have, and which values are theirs to defend. And the concept or the instrument that Pizzorno uses to articulate this argument is the one of the mask, really thought as a mask of theater. And basically the mask is the way in which the individual can act in the public world. And like a mask in theater, this is both personal and collective. It's personal because it's worn by the individual, but it's collective because it's recognizable by others. So in this sense, the mask, it's not something that conceals the authentic self. It's a vehicle through which your political identity becomes intelligible to others. So once it's a socialist, once it's a Catholic, once it's a Flemish nationalist. It's a way in which people understand what other people are in what he calls circles of recognition. So you wear a mask in a circle of recognition because identity gets its shapes only through interaction. The last author I want to mention is Chantal Mouffe, because she has also a very compelling, very contemporary view of political collective identities. And basically, she defines the political by the distinction between friend and enemy. And she says that any collective identity is necessarily formed in opposition to something else. In this sense, political identities are ways in which to enter the conflict. But even more than that, political identities are forged through conflict, to what you think you want from and how you want to differentiate one the other and different vision on the words. And in this sense, the democratic task is not to dissolve this conflict, which she calls antagonism, but to tame it into agonism. So the idea is that democracy should be a system of rules in which everybody can recognize each other in conflict, but in respect of some rules and recognizing each other legitimacy. So these are the three disciplines. And as I already said, I think it's pretty obvious as political theory and social psychology have many similarities. First of all, for both disciplines, identity is relational. It's constituted through membership in a group and defined in part through contrast with an outgroup. It's action generating. It's not just reflecting pre-existing preference, but motivates and shapes behavior. And it's also affectively charged. belonging to an in-group is not something just cognitive, but also involves feelings of attachment, of pride, and of solidarity. There are also important differences here that actually, I think, enrich the study of political identity. And the main difference is there is that, especially when we think about Pizzorno, he asks practically about the condition under which collective identities emerge, consolidate, and dissolve. It's evolution of identity during time and certain condition. While in social identity theory, we most look at the mechanism through which a group of members shapes condition and affects our thinking once the identity is in place. So this is more a theory of universal psychological tendency. And there's also, of course, the idea that political theorists have a very strong normative engagement with the concept. For example, the distinction of MOOF between agonism and antagonism. And one obvious difference here is that, of course, political theorists don't engage with the concept empirically, but only theoretically. While social psychologists, of course, have a lot of engagement, empirical engagement with the concept. Empirical engagement, once again, was the way in which political science entered the concept. But when, a couple of decades later, they started to engage with the concept theoretically, the way they took was basically the one of rational choice. These are the 80s, it's the moment of rational choice. It's actually the moment in which Pizzorno starts his critique to rational choice. But this is the idea of party identification, as in Fiorina, as a running tally. It's thinking of party more as an heuristic, more as an evaluation, a retrospective evaluations of how, for example, a party governed, and decided this party governed well or not. Am I going to vote them for again or not? So it's a very instrumental way of looking at partisanship. And with years, we saw that the model really had a lot of things that didn't work out in a certain way. The model was kind of questioned in many times in the 2 decades following. And here we arrive at the first clear engagement with the idea of expressive partisanship or identitarian partisanship with Leonie Addy. She has this seminal paper, which is From Social to Political Identity. Leonie Addy is a social psychologist that basically went to political science. And in this paper, she really tries to understand how to take the concept of social psychology in political, how they could work for political identities that are more partisan identities, because social psychology mostly worked with ethnic and national identities. And actually in this paper, she really shows that there are many things many concepts, many ways in which we think about those identities that don't fully apply to political identity as a party identity. Despite this wonderful paper and the engagement with the concept in an identitarian way, and all the work that she did after, for example, about instrumental versus expressive partisanship, this idea of identitarian expressive way to be member of a party actually exploded only in 2012 with the work of Iyengar on affective polarization, which became a buzzword that we all use now. We're engaging with it since actually that paper, Affect Not Ideology, was out. The thing is that when Iyengar and his colleagues started thinking about partisanship and affective polarization in that way, they had in mind specifically the American context. And the American context vis-a-vis political identities is a context with the two-party system, completely different from the West European one, and in general the European one. When you think of a multi-party system, identities, political identities, are a much more complicated story with much more variations. And this is where actually this is the point in which I started to engage with this concept, right? I loved the literature on affective polarization. I saw that not everything, and many together with me, was immediately applicable to to the way in which we conceive politics in multi-party systems, and especially in Europe. And when I had to think or what is the base of affective polarization, of the way we engage with this literature, how do we think in terms of anchoring our identities, the way in which I thought chronologically, literally, was in three ways. And the first way in which we can think of political identities is the one of direction. One can have a positive and a negative attachment to things. You can have a positive and a negative identity. The second level, it is the level of ideologies versus parties. One thing in which in Europe stuff gets a bit more complex, but also more intriguing in a sense, is that your identity can be attached to a broader label, and this actually reasons a lot with social psychology and the idea of self-categorization. So you can identify, most actually voters identify themselves as a progressive, conservative, leftist, right-wing. Very few voters mention one specific party. And lately, the concept I started to engage with, its centrality. So how central is a political identity for citizens? On these three topics, I'm going to show you some empirics, some data, some analysis, and they all come from the same data set. This is data that we collected in February 2023 across 12 political systems. I'm going to say country every now and then, but it's political system because for reasons that I don't feel I have to explain to this specific audience, we split it Belgium in two. And then we had 1,000 respondents per polity. And this was an online survey with quotas for age, gender, and education. So starting with direction. I have this clear memory of being in this social psychology conference and somebody using affective polarization and negative partisanship in an interchangeable way. And I didn't understand why, and I wanted to understand what was the difference. So I started digging into definitions, and at a certain point, when I wanted to look for negative partisanship, I arrived actually at partisanship. And I remember going to the Oxford Dictionary of Political Science and being quite surprised not to find a definition. The definition that I found in that dictionary was a list of operationalization. And when you think about the history of the concept in politics, it makes sense, right? This is the way in which the concept entered the discipline, through operationalization. But it's striking that at that point in the early 2020, still we didn't have a definition per se. And when you look at these operationalizations, especially with regard to West Europe, it's never an operationalization on the level of identity. We are going to see why actually this is a good idea. But it's normally closeness or attachment. So the questions that you are going to be asked, when people want to understand whether you're a partisan, is how close you are to a certain party or how attached are you to a certain party. But actually closeness is the one that they use the most. The other data that is quite striking is that we are really, as political scientists, empirical political sciences especially, engaging with positive partisanship. But positive partisanship, it's steeply declining. And actually many people are really worried about this because partisanship declining can mean, actually often means also less people turning out to vote, less people engaging in politics. But what I started to wonder there is that, is it so bad or is it a problem with the operationalization? And this brings us to ideology. When you think about the fact that the discipline engage with these concepts in a very empirical way, you also have to think about the way in which we engage with ideology, right? And ideology, it's normally a left-right continuum, 10 or 11-point scale, which is hardly ever used or even an object of investigation per se. It's normally a control variable. So it's something we control for. We don't engage with what it means to be that per se. While when you think about it, what empirical scientists do is that they take party, and they use party as a proxy, basically, for ideology, which is not always something that works. First of all, it doesn't work for certain parties that are, for example, post-ideological, that are in the center, that refuse to engage with really being on a side. But it means that we have quite of a operationalizational problem there. And finally, identity formation. We know that the identities are not only positives, that are actually negative. It's really an important side of the identity formation. But when you go to one of these CSCS, of this big data collection, normally we ask only positive partisanship. But think about the disciplines the other two disciplines I just mentioned. Social psychology, outgroup, political theory, agonism, antagonism, opponents, recognition. The negative part of political identity, it's an enormous part. It's really easy for humans, for the way we're wired, to understand first who we are not, rather than commit our complete identity, for example, to a specific party. Much easier to a broader concept of being, for example, leftist or right-wing. So, there is even research that actually said that negative identity can be primary identities. This is Zongo, also a wonderful paper. So my first step in the world of political identities was via negative partisanship. And when you start digging into the literature, which is really small compared to the positive partisanship literature, you see that negative partisanship, it is an identity. And basically addressed an important part of who you are, which is what you are not, how you define yourself in opposition, indifference to things that you really don't like, that actually it's more than don't like, that you despise. We also know that it's not the flip side of positive partisanship. It's not that you have this amount of positive partisanship for a certain party, you are going to have exactly the same much for another party or other parties. We are going to see this in the next parts of the talk, but first of all, they are almost never specular. They normally have different quantities, but you can have positive partisanship without having a negative one, and vice versa. But this is hardly ever acknowledged. And third thing, it's not the same of affective polarization. We should not think that the negative is just a huge thing over there, which is just negative. Negative partisanships are negative identities. They're something super powerful and very stable that hardly ever change, and they should be operationalized, measured, conceived at the identity level. Affective polarization, especially the way we measure it now, it's an attitude. So to give just a sketch, which is of course oversimplification of the way this works, we should imagine political identities to be here, with social identities, basically, and with other stable characteristics of the personalities. They are, of course, embedded in a context, but these stable characteristics normally, for the large part, leads to emotion and cognition, and this, in turn, leads to the level of attitude, which 50% of the time, according to social psychology, can translate into behavior. So, social identities, including political identities, are here, and attitudes and behavior are here. Identities come before attitudes and behavior. This means that when we do research, empirical research, this is something that we need to operationalize and measure and put in our analysis in a way that it's prior to the attitude, and we need to have it there. So, when you get into this problem, you quickly see that there are three things to address. One is the operationalization. You need to have a construct that works for negative identities. And it should be something that doesn't blur with the affective polarization, which is normally measured at the level of I like this party, I don't like this party. This is not liking, this is being. This is something stable. The second, it's actually the impact that you have on this construct as an out-group feeling and on affective polarization in general. If it comes before, it should have an impact on it, right? And we should be able to observe it. The third is the spread. Our spread is negative partisanship. It's the same as positive partisanship. It's more, it's less, it's something people think about it at all. And there is a fourth, which is a bonus, and I won't spoiler now. Operationalization. So this is work I did with my colleague Sabrina Meyer, and what we did was going through all the very painful stages of validating a new measurement. And what we found out was that two items, which are then ended up to be the two items of our short scale, worked best. And one was based on values, norms. This is the normative side of negative feelings, of negative partisanship. The party's values go against everything that is important to me. First item. Second item, it is important to me that I'm not one of those that vote for this party. Sense of self. So the two things that are in this scale are actually norms, a normative level of what you think it's unthinkable to vote for, and which group you are part of. I want to add something. You see this item here, which is in gray. And this is an item that works wonders in US. It works very well. And it's when I talk about this party, I say they rather than we. In our validation, this was the item that performed the worst in Germany and in Italy, so where we tested this scale. It really worked super poorly because Europeans tend not to think at parties this way, as we or they. They tend to think normally at ideological blocks this way. So, can we see an impact of these contracts on outgroup feelings and affective polarization? We can. Here we see positive partisanship and negative partisanship. Positive partisanship, here it's operationalized as closeness to a party. And you can see that when we want to predict affective polarization, positive partisanship actually has a bigger effect than negative partisanship. Mind now, affective polarization, it's a vertical, what we call a vertical concept. This is how an individual sees a party, right? These other two, in which negative partisanship leads, are what we call horizontal concept. This is outgroup dislike. And the question here was, I dislike certain people because of their political views. And this was, I avoid certain people because of their political views. So you see here that on the vertical level, positive partisanship, your positive attachment makes a difference, but on the negative, on the horizontal level, social fabric, how you interact with others, it's the negative one that makes a difference. Spread. So here we have in light blue positive partisanship and in dark blue negative partisanship. And these are two different operationalizations of positive partisanship. One very strict, are you close to a party? And most people here actually answer no. And this is, are you at least closer to a party? So this is much broader. But you can see that in both cases, negative partisanship is way higher in the minds of voters than positive partisanship. And here, when we have we have a more inclusive sense of positive partisanship. There are only 4 countries out of 12 in which positive partisanship is a bit higher, and those are Austria, Wallonia in Belgium, it's almost there, and then we have Portugal and United Kingdom. And notice that Wallonia and United Kingdom, at the time in which we collected this data, were the only 2 countries without a far-right party, because UKIP was basically not there in 2023. Bonus. What drives negative partisanship? It's actually populist radical right parties. So you can see here, this is descriptive of how many people answered yes or no to this is whether the least liked party, the party towards which they had negative partisanship, was a radical right party. And you can see here that in all countries it's more than 50%. And in 3 countries, it's actually more than 70. So it is, and this is consistent also with what we know about affective polarization, for example, the work of Elko Arteveld. But this is also consistent with the idea of norms. Is it a bad thing to be polarized, to have negative partisanship, if it's toward actors that have illiberal ideas, for example? Think of Germany. This is not an empirical question. This is a normative question. Second aspect, its level. This is something that I already talked about, and it's the fact that in Europe we have these two potential levels of attachment, a broader level of ideological camp and a level of specific parties. And one thing that started to puzzle me at a certain point is that, okay, we know that we have decline in positive partisanship. We know that positive partisanship, I even saw it in my own data, is driving affective polarization. How is it possible that we have rising affective polarization and declining negative partisanship? It was really an empirical, it was an oddity a bit. And this is where, again, I started thinking, okay, we needed to really start thinking of where we place positive political identity. And we know already from other research that political identity is not always anchored in a single party. And we also know that because of self-categorization, because of the circle of recognitions, negativity has a huge place into this. But in general, what we don't account for in our current research is that identity anchoring in multi-party system, it's more flexible and it's way more complex than in two-party systems. So just borrowing this empirical research, this concept, this construct that come from US might not work for us. So the way in which my co-author, Joachim van Acht, and I talk about this was, okay, this was very exploratory. So we had a question in this questionnaire, in this survey, in which we asked people whether they had an attachment to an ideological camp and attachment to a party. This is a categorical question. And of course, you have people that are not attached to anything. And these are, we call them the non-identifier. But when the one who are attached, we thought, but this is not inductive. We really gave only this alternative. We thought, okay, you can attach in three ways. You can be attached just to your political camp. You can be attached to a party, but it's important for you that that's in that political camp. Or you can be just attached to a party. I was thinking, being Italian, for example, about the five-star movements because they branded themselves as post-ideological. But it applies, I think, to a lot of centrist party. So here we have basically the non-identifiers, the pure partisan, just a party, the partisan ideologue, I like that party, but I like it also because it's within that block, and we have the pure ideologues. The first question that I had is that how many? How many are per type? And you can see that actually the mode, by very little, it's ideologue. And the second mode is non-identifiers, and then we have the partisan ideologue and the partisans. So it's actually the pure partisans are really, really few. Most people are ideologues or non-identifiers. And here's where we have, for example, we could start having worries about absence of political identity. This was 30%. It's not nothing, right? It was really something in the sample. And when you split this through the sample that we have, the interesting thing is that the two modes across countries were only either ideologues or non-identifiers, and there were 6 countries and 6 countries. So the countries in which you see the red frame are the countries in which the modes it's non-identifiers, and the other ones in which the mode is identifier. And you see that there is a lot of variation, but when the mode is non-identifier, is always going to be ideologue and vice versa. So these are the two types that are the most frequent. Partisans are always the smallest part, and this is exactly what we ask in questionnaires. So you really start seeing that we have a problem there in terms of what we are operationalizing. So the question that we ask is that, okay, how much are we capturing? How much the two concepts overlap? This typology that we created and parties and traditional partisanship. And we basically tested to predict a higher and lower level of affective polarization. And this is traditional partisanship. Here we have non-partisans, weak partisan, closer to a party, strong partisan, close to a party. And here you have our typology. And you see that it goes the same direction. These are the partisans. These are the partisans ideologue, and these are the ideologue. So it goes in the same direction, but when you look at it, who we are missing the most, who are the most far away from, are the ideologues, which are the mode. These are a lot of people in our countries, and we're completely missing on them. Final concept, the one in which I'm engaging in the last few months. Both negativity at the level in which you attach, at which you anchor identity, I think are super important. We know that from social psychology, we know that from political theory. But what about, especially really at the positive anchoring? How important is this identity at all in your life, right? How important, how central it's a political identity in defining who you are. Let's take a step back, because here operationalization is also important. We know, we already discussed, that partisanship is measured either as a simple categorization, Democrat, Republican, you can add strength to it, and in Europe through attachment and closeness. In US, also as an identity, doesn't work very well in Europe for obvious reasons. We also know, and we just talked about the fact that ideological camps and the negative side of attachments are very important parts. But what about how important is the self, it's this political identity to one's self-concept? You can think of this, and this I borrowed from social psychology, in two ways: salience and centrality. Now, to a political scientist, salience would sound more familiar and more what we're looking for. But actually, when you go into that literature, you see that it's actually not. So salience in social psychology is the readiness with which an identity is activated as a cognitive schema in response to social cue. So, for example, it might be that when there are elections, your political identity is activated, but it's something that is not very central to your concept of self. While centrality, it's really the subjective importance an individual ascribed to an identity as a component of the self-concept. So how this makes me who I am. And the way, and this is incredibly very unused in politicals. I could find only 2 papers about this that only use it as a moderator. And the operationalization, also this was very exploratory, we used in this survey, is to what extent would you say that your political convictions and beliefs determines who you are as a person? When I thought of this question, I left it very open because I didn't want to anchor it to parties per se. You can have political identities that are not party identity, they are not ideological identity, but they are still political identities. We can think of many, right? We can think of, for example, being somebody who cares about the environment, that's a political identity. We can think about being a feminist, that's also a political identity. So when people read this, I want them to feel free to think very broadly about political identities. I could still, right, do cross tabulations. And when you look at the overall distribution, I was actually surprised, because you remember how many non-identifiers we had. But when you look here, okay, it's 30% of the overall samples. This is 11,000, right, respondents. It's only 30%. It's not that much. So shall we be so worried that people don't have political identities? Actually, when we look at this, for a lot of people, more than half of the sample, political identity is pretty important to their self-concept. When you look at here, the mean is 4.20, so it's over, let's say, the mid percentile. And you have a lot of people, the mode it's actually 5, and okay, to only 8% is to a great extent, but I would expect this from this kind of survey. And when you look at these odds across countries, you can see that my personal anecdote and experience gets vindicated. Italy, first country. So here the mean, it's 4.8. Italians care a lot about who they are politically, probably because we talk about it so much. Flanders, again to vindicate my experience, it's only 3.8. So you see that there is quite some variation, but with only 4 countries falling on the negative side of the mean. The first thing that I thought is that, okay, validity. Am I asking what I think am I asking? And I did a correlation test to check for what we call convergent and criterion validity. Basically, I wanted to be sure that the concept, the question was understood the way it should have been understood, but also that the concept was still distinct enough and close enough, right, to where it should be. And you see that the highest correlation here, it's political interest. You would expect that. The more this is central to your life, the more you're politically interested. And the lowest was negative partisanship, but they were all positive and they were all significant. So this is very promising, and I was convinced that the question actually worked the way I wanted. And when you cross it with typology, also works the way you want, and also tells you something interesting here. Non-identifiers, as you should expect, are the one with the lowest mean of political identity centrality, of course. But this is not that low. These people that don't identify with parties still have political identity. And of course, it's higher for ideologues and partisans, and it goes the way you would predict, right, with intensity of partisanship. Ideologue here, then partisan ideologue, and then partisans here. But when you look at the differences, there are very small difference. So the jump here, it's being somewhat engaged with politics and not being engaged. But even the ones that are not engaged are not completely... only 8% we saw it's really not engaging with politics in their life. So again, I wanted to understand the difference between horizontal and vertical engagement. And I'm sorry, here it's really too small, but I can tell you that here it's centrality, here it's positive partisanship, this is negative partisanship, political interest, and this is a bunch of socio-demographic control. And here I'm predicting affective polarization, intention to vote, and social avoidance. So these two are definitely vertical concept, and this is again my horizontal concept. It's how much to avoid people that have certain political opinion. And you can see that for the vertical concept, again, positive partisanship definitely leads the explanation, in a sense, is the most powerful predictor. But again, for social avoidance, it's centrality. And this makes sense again. If your political identity is central to you, makes up for the values you care for, you don't want to really engage with people that have widely different opinions, political opinions than yours. The thing is that when I developed the typology, I was happy. I thought it was very interesting. But when you engage with typology, especially in this way, you have to basically impose your thinking, right? So you think about a variable, how I'm going to, so you pre-impose your thinking on the voters. And what I wanted to do here was something different, a bit more inductive. I wanted the data to talk to me as far as possible, even if I made the questions. So I wanted to create a sort of compass using self-concept and direction. So political identity centrality and positive and negative identification. So I decided not to go for a typology. I could have used these variables to create a typology, and instead I went for a latent profile analysis, which, I mean, gives you a typology, but it's not a typology that you pre-thought. In this case, I used settings in which basically I didn't pre-impose any numbers of category. This is just what emerged from the data. And latent profile analysis is just a method that groups people into distinct types, so it gives you somewhat a typology, but it's based on patterns on the response. So it basically tries to make the data reveal hidden profiles. And what we have here is 4 profiles. For disclosure, for positive partisanship, I had to use a dummy, being or not being a partisan, because for attachment 1 to 7, my sample was too small. It was 6,000 some. So I had so many missing data. I had about 4,000 missings, and I thought I'm losing too much information. So here I used a dummy. That's why for certain categories, it's either the maximum or none, because that's the nature of the variable. But when I did robustness check, it gave me the same results, basically. So here we have the first category. It's disengaged people. They don't have a positive identification. They do have a relatively small negative partisanship, and they have the lowest level of identity centrality. The second profile, it's engage opponents. Also, no positive partisanship, but they do have a very high negative partisanship and a bit of a higher identity centrality. Third type, it's the moderate partisans. I should add, the engaged opponents are 34% of the sample. So this is the largest group, followed by the disengaged. And then the third one is the moderate partisan. This is the smallest, 11%. They have a positive partisanship. They have a very small negative partisanship and a bit more identity centrality. And then we have the intense partisan. These are the ones that score the highest on everything. And these are 25%, so they're not that few. So these are the profiles that emerge. And I think that it's super, one important thing is that I then did the latent profile analysis per country, and the structure old in all countries. So this is not an artifact of the polling. This actually works across 12 polities. And when you look at how it distributes, I think the metaphor of the compass reasons better with you. Because this is an instrument, it works in all contexts, but it points to completely different directions. So each of these rows gives 100%, right? And you can see the composition of disengaged, engaged opponent, moderate partisan, and intense partisan. And the only thing that you can see everywhere is that the moderate partisans are not that many. If you are a partisan, you tend to be an intensive partisan, and there are many engaged opponents. But when you look, for example, that mostly disengaged are, when you look at Wallonia and United Kingdom, again, the only two parties without a negative, without a radical right party, these are the countries in which we found the most disengaged. While, for example, Spain is the country with a very engaged opponent and intense partisan, so really driven by negative partisanship in a sense. So you see that the same instrument points to a different north. And when you think about it, what is that north? It's the composition of the party system. It's the party offer. It's how people react to a certain elite, to a certain offer that is given to them. So here is the same exercise that I did before with the single variables. I did it for profiles. Which kind of profiles predict what? And here you can see that the engaged opponents and that for affective polarization, basically it follows the strength of positive partisanship. Same for turnout. Positive partisanship, what makes the jumps between being an engaged opponent or having a positive partisanship. And again, with the horizontal construct with social avoidance, centrality and negative partisanship, which are very strong in intense partisan, suddenly take the lead here. So again, showing that negativity, that this idea of how certain things are important to me in the sense that I don't want them, actually shapes the way in which we interact with people. I want to add here something. In a lot of literature of affective polarization, especially because it was developed in US, this is believed to be a bad thing, that you don't want to deal with these people. But again, I want you to think of if in our countries, these people are mostly AfD, Chega, Vox. Is this a bad thing per se? Or is it something, a sort of implicit cordon sanitaire in places where a cordon sanitaire is not in place? And here we come to the relation to the radical right parties. And you can see that this is how prone each of this profile is to vote for these parties. And the disengaged and the moderate partisans are the ones that are the most prone to vote to them. Again, here, these two groups, the two led by negative partisanship, the engaged opponents and the intense partisans, are the ones that are the least prone to vote for radical right parties. It's also interesting to see, with regard to this, that in almost all countries with a consolidated radical right party, Italy, Austria, France, Flanders, the Netherlands, Portugal, the the radical right party electorate is mainly composed of disengaged and moderate partisans. And the opponents almost everywhere, you can see it here, the engaged opponents are the least likely to support these parties. There is only one exception with, a couple exceptions with Spain and Greece, but overall, this is another indication that basically, although there is a substantial heterogeneity at all levels, the party system is what drives our attachment feeling. So I'll start to wrap up here. The first thing that I want to do is 3 remarks on the data that I just showed today. And the first one is that political identity, it's probably better not to be thought as an identity dimension, like we think right in bipolar way about affective polarization, about left and right. It's better not to take political identity, to think of political identity as something that you can really measure on a simple continuum in a bipolar way. We saw that when we use it together with direction, it actually organizes for stable configuration, and all this configuration exists in non-trivial portions in all countries. The second one is that we see that there are different consequences. There are different consequences at what I called the vertical and the horizontal level. So this means that this profile are not just descriptive profile. They mean something substantive for democracy, for the way in which we vote, for the way in which we live with other people. And the last one is the centrality of the engaged opponents. We saw that the engaged opponents are the largest share of this sample, 34%. And we saw that basically in the dummy variable that I had on partisanship, they don't have a positive partisanship. But when you cross this together with the typology that I showed you before, a lot of these people have an ideological identity. So they do have a positive attachment that we are simply unable to capture. So my closing remarks are going to be about future research. The first thing is that especially political science needs to start thinking about political identity beyond the concept of partisanship. We need to especially include the idea of we have to think of way in which we integrate the attachment to camps and that we disentangle that together with party. How we make this measurement non-redundant and most importantly meaningful, that it tells us something. It tells us something about our electorate and what this electorate does with those identity. From social psychology, we saw that they don't engage much with political identity per se. It would be incredibly helpful if some of the discipline would actually refocus on thinking about political identities as party identities, attachment to certain ideas, and not just as ethnicity or nationality, so give an identity in their specificity. I think this would be incredibly profitable for advancing the discipline, the topic, modern discipline. Finally, for political theory, we saw that these 4 profiles actually have different meaning in what they express when you put them in the context. And especially when you think about radical right party, when you think about antagonism, what agonism mean, what are circle of recognitions, who we recognize, we don't want to recognize. It's something that political theory can really help empirical research to reason a bit better on the meaning of the finding that we have. And the very last thing is that I gave a very traditional talk in a sense. I thought of political identities in the way in which I was taught. Partisanship, ideology, left-right continuum. But when you look around, when you look at the contemporary world, actually there are new types of identities, that political identities that are emerging, and then these categories really are not able to measure or to understand what they mean for democracy, for future democracy, for current democracy. And I can think of many, right? I can think about environmentalism, for example. But the one that hit me the most in I think in the last year was really the dimension of the manosphere, probably because there is this documentary out now. But we see that with the manosphere, for example, these new identities, these new political identities getting entrenched with the radical right, for example. How can we capture that? How can we study that empirically? How can we understand also the psychological mechanism that it's there? In the sense that when you think about it from a social psychology point of view, this is probably one of the topics in which we need the engagement of social identity theory with also role identity theory and personal identity theory to try to disentangle the dimension of gender and politics, how they interact with each other. And for political theory, for how much I understand, which is I'm an empirical political scientist, but for what I read, basically engages most with the idea that with the idea of recognition. And I'm thinking here, for example, the recognition theory of Honneth, but I'm also thinking of the identitarian pluralism of Charles Taylor. And they were developed for historically subordinated groups. So these theories will struggle to account for identities that perceive themselves as a majority under threat, and they are not inherent minorities. There is also here the boundary between legitimate adversary and enemy. I'm thinking of MUF here, that becomes particularly fluid in these identities because the opponent is not another party, but it's another social category. It's an entire different way of thinking about enemies. And this also brings another question. What is the relationship between political identifications and pre-political social hierarchies? And to what extent a democratically compatible identity can be grounded in denial of recognition to other social groups? So my very, very final note is that when you think of something as complex as political identities, as identity for democracies, what they mean in democracies, you need interdisciplinary research. It's important that each discipline advance within the disciplines, with the tool of the disciplines, but for the future of social science, and more importantly, for the future of democracy, it's really important that social science start to talk with each other and to do structural work together, because complex problems, multi-phase problems like identity, really need the effort of everybody working together under different perspective, empirical, psychological universal mechanism, and normative claims. Thank you.
Thank you, Luana. Fantastic lecture. Thank you.
I talked a bit too long. Sorry.
That's fine. That's fine. We open the floor for questions or comments. Who has a question or comments for Luana?
Luana, thank you for the talk. I knew it was going to be good, and it actually was. So thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this this great talk. You know who I am, so you know what question I'm going to ask. Well, it's a bit of a messy question. So you very clearly indicate, okay, these are the bodies of literature I draw on and I speak to and I use to discuss the topic of political identity. And I think you do that in a brilliant way. Further down, later in your talk, you say, okay, I use the literatures that I was taught. And of course, there's, from my perspective, a huge blanco. Because when we talk about political theory on identity, there's this huge literature out there called feminist political theory that talks a lot about political identity. And that is missing, and not only in your talk, in the entire literature on what is called political identity. But then the question becomes, what is your definition of political identity when you ignore all that literature? And that then brings you to the conclusion that there are new political identities, the manosphere. And then I think, this is not new. This is something we know already for like half a century. And we have theorized this. So, and I totally see this, why you take these steps when you build from what is traditionally understood as political theory, but it is very exclusive, an exclusive understanding of what political theory is. And I think when you bring in the literature of many, many authors, but I think of one in particular, Anne Phillips, on political identity and politics of presence and so on and so forth, that might enrich also, not your empirical study, which is extremely rich and sophisticated, but the theoretical framing might be different. And so my question would be, your definition of political identity, isn't that already something that is close to party political ideology political identity? This is a messy question.
Shall I answer or you want to collect? I prefer answering, yeah. Okay, thank you, Karen. Yeah, I also, when I started, I said I'm not a political theorist, right? So I already knew I was going to upset people in the room. I am, as a formation, my PhD, everything, I am an empirical political scientist, right? So my primary goal is to try to understand how can I take a concept, operationalize it, measure it, understand how it talks to other concepts. So I don't have I'm not as conceited as thinking I can really engage with political theory. It's not what I studied for 20 years. You ask me, what is your definition of political identity? I think that the whole talk was about political identity as identities that get represented in political parties, or how we think of our political identities. And when you think of the empirical work that has been done on parties and broader ideological identities in quantitative political science, it is about basically voting. Right? So when we think of political identity, we think of how this identity leads us to vote. And that's also why I put the last part, let's say, we should think of other identities at the end. I am interested in new political identities insofar, in my own research, insofar they get entrenched with parties, with representation during political campaign, if people vote for certain things. What I am a bit afraid here is that this line of research that I'm really interested in, it is indeed, as you said, as a blind side, right? Because people engage with politics in several ways. One is that I bet I missed another 20, right? Because if somebody from, I don't know, an environmental activist would be here, they would probably give me exactly the same remark. With the caveat that there are green parties, but they're not exactly what they're doing there, right? But I don't. That's my thing. That I don't. When you saw during the talk, I never gave a definition of political identity. I don't think you can give one definition of political identity. It's always going to be what you're looking at from the lens of political psychology, identity. Social psychology, identity is going to be a group membership. From the lens of empirical political science, is going to be what you attach to and what are the heuristic in terms of which kind of identity gives you the heuristic for voting. And I'm definitely closest to this. What I'm saying is exactly what you're saying, right? That because we are within these disciplines, because we don't talk to one another that much, we are probably missing spots in this that would actually help us understanding reality and how people think of who they are and how they're driven to vote in a way better way. If I have to think really like an empiricist, what I look at when I run a regression, the first thing is the R-square. What the R-square tells me is how much I explained of this phenomenon. And when I find that 20%, I pop a bottle, I'm explaining 20% of a phenomenon. And I think it's a limit that we have to accept when we engage in empirical research, but it also means I think very often it means that this is also self-reflection. When I find 20% variance and I'm so happy, it's mostly that I have inherently accepted that this is how much I can explain with that approach, and I'm happy with that. And I think maybe in a bit of a delusional way, it's important that we continue to work within our discipline, but it's also, what I saw, the more I engaged with political identity, is that indeed that I had many blind spots, right? That the political theory that I know is the political theory that I studied at the university. But I wasn't exposed to much more after that. And the fact that we are closed in our disciplines helps the disciplines to advance and the concept within the disciplines to advance. But if we really want to have a better understanding of phenomena, we need to start talking more with each other. Because, of course, we are in an era in which you need specialists. I need to be a specialist in my field. I need to know how to do certain things. It's impossible for me to read or cultivate or get other perspective in a way I would need to take 4 PhDs, right? And that's not what it's feasible. For me, it was really an invite of the moment in which you dive a bit more in a concept, you indeed start seeing how many blind spots you have. And I think for political identity, this is particularly true, more than for other things, because it's a bit broader, right? You're not studying the turnout to vote. You're not studying something this little. You're studying something that many disciplines approached.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Luana. So many fascinating insights. We could be discussing this for like ages. So I will try to limit myself to 2 questions and comments. So one of the passages I found more interesting is when you talked about political identity centrality. And you said that actually this can be quite high among people who don't feel close to any political party or not even any ideological camp. So I was wondering about the consequences or implications of these for both their political behavior and eventually democracy at large. And I don't know if you already did some analysis on this or not. But my point would be, if I am a person with strong political identity centrality and at the same time I don't find any political party to identify with, or not even any ideological camp, what kind of feelings do I develop? Like, do I get frustrated? Do I get alienated from politics and democracy? Because I feel like, politics is part of my identity, but at the same time, there's no receiver of this kind of centrality that I assign to politics. Do I get like either dissatisfied, or do I express my voice by voting for anti-system parties or stuff like that? So, this is a kind of link that came to my mind, and I was wondering if you have some insights on these, or if it can be something to consider for future research. And then second point is not about, the empirics themselves, but a sort of comment that you made at some point when you were thinking about affective polarization and the consequences. And you said, we tend to take for granted that this is something negative based on American kind of literature. But maybe, if in Europe, affective polarization also is like a tool to build some cordon sanitaires against the populist radical right, then maybe it's not something bad. And I mean, in principle, I tend to agree. But at the same time, what if, the voters of the populist radical right are, let's say, 30, 35, 40% of the voters in a country? Then it would mean that if affective polarization is concentrated against them, maybe the rest of the population is going to develop strong negative feeling towards those 40% of the people in the country. So, maybe thinking that they are something alien, something far from us is not the best, because it's going to create indeed, in the end, completely polarized society in which dialogue and compromise is not possible. So, yeah, I know it's a very big topic, but yeah, you made me think about very, very big questions.
Thank you for your questions. I feel it's impossible to answer to the first one, I'm afraid, in the sense that this is a question on motives, right? What do I feel? What do I do when I have a political identity in some way and I don't vote for a party? And here there are 200 possible explanations, right? So some people are going to very upsetly voting for something. Some people are not. Some people are not going to vote and be upset. Some people are going to think, I'll wait for the next election. So here it also depends on the political identity centrality, because I think that the way in which I grew a bit unsatisfied of the problem of the too little political identity is that we tend to focus on the consequences, and the consequences is not voting, and not voting is bad, and also voting poorly is bad. But why people don't go to vote, it's not always because there is no party that reflects what they're thinking. It can be something broader. It can be, for example, we know that in corrupt countries, it's a broad question of trust. So the answers that I can give you there could be trust, could be something that has to do with also the psychology of the person, right? Some people just like to be a way of contentious things like at elections. Some people think that their party is going to lose anyways, so why they would go to vote? How the dissatisfaction towards politics gets translated into a certain behavior, I think it's also something that varies across from country to country. I remember seeing this research, for example, about UK that showed that people didn't go to vote, not only because they thought that, we're talking 20 years ago, so not modern conservatives, but they thought that it didn't really make a difference whether the Tories or the Labour were in power, not because they didn't like them, but because they thought the country is in good hands anyways, right? So it could be also a lot of trust. But they didn't feel attached to any of the two parties. So I think the question that you asked, what happens when people don't find a party that they want to vote for, depends on two things. The context of the country, the political offer, the cultural context, is there a lot of corruption, is there something systemic, and it interacts with the personality of those people, and there could also be a generational effect, but I'm really not an expert on that specifically. For the second question, I think it's a very interesting question, and it's something that also on this I don't have an answer, but I have more educated guests because I talk a lot about this, right? And for me, this is about how radical we are about liberal democracy and norms. And this is also a continuum. Some people tend to be really radical and say, I don't care if you're 30%. And here of the population, if 30% of Germans vote for AfD, AfD still stands for things that are not liberal democracy, and I'm not going to go for those. So there is this implicit or explicit cordon sanitaire, and I think it's a completely legitimate way of thinking. And when you reason in a completely normative way, I don't think that majority matters anymore, right? I remember being in this room and the person answered, okay, Mussolini had majority of votes, right? Does it mean it was good? What does it mean for society that we're so that there is so much division? That's a way more complex question. And again, I think it's for the context of each. I don't think there is a recipe for everything. I don't believe that the answer that I can give for Italy will apply to Flanders, will apply to Germany. I think that the specific political context matters a lot here. But in general, I personally tend to be with normative people. And when you read, for example, the book of Vicente Valentim on norms, basically what he says is that the more you cave in, the more you talk with these people, and with radical right beliefs, anti-liberal beliefs, and you make them feel legitimate, the more other people are going to think. So it's circles of recognitions again. So if we think in this way of circles of recognition, who we recognize as an actor, do we want to go in agonism, antagonism? I think it's where the answer is. I'm not 100% sure it's empirical.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Luana. This is very interesting from my own research, since I work on immigrant political participation and also the role of xenophobic parties. So your points about how we think about identity and negative and positive partisanship, I think is really interesting. You mentioned already trust, which was one of the kind of variables that I'd be interested to know more if you're thinking about. But primarily, I was thinking about what do you think is the role of issue salience in all of this? Do you think this is just an expression of how formed your political identity is in terms of a clear ideology or identification, and then you use certain issues that you can talk about socially, right? So immigration is just, a way of me talking about how I already feel about a clear political project that I have? Or do you see it as more of a driver of this identity formation? Because some argue that when we have these moments of issue salience, it helps people to connect underlying values with the political moment and realize that, that centrality of politics that they felt already can be addressed now through action. So I just wondered how you see it, because I work on immigration, but as you mentioned on environmentalism, there are many people who think that issue salience would be really central if we look at polarization today.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. When you mentioned salience, I was thinking actually of the book that is now, I think, about to be out, of James Tilley and Sarah Hobbolt, and they talk about Brexit and how Brexit became an identity and started just being an issue, right? It was an issue and it became an identity. So I think issue salience is very important, but I think it's how that issue, it's salient for how many people, right? So Brexit became an identity because it was salient for the whole population. And I think that other topics, like, for example, environment, become an identity only for certain people or don't become salient for the whole population, simply because not everybody gets the salience of it, and not for everybody it's a deal breaker. Things become salient when you invest indeed your identity, when you are able to commit your identity to those things. And there are very few things that become salient without being in a some sort of pattern, right? We reason in terms of left and right. It's the cleavage theory. And in cleavage theory, there is a lot of identity. But we reason in that way because that's the scheme that we are exposed to. For reason according to a certain issue, and for that issue to become what we would call a collision or a permanent division, it really means, it has to mean that it's something that the whole population feel about. I think with the migration, this happened. Actually, migration is the new theme of it's the out-group of the right. And on that thing, I think the right was incredibly successful in making the issue extremely salient, so salient that it became a feature of identity, who you identify as in-group and out-group. I hope I answered. Yes.
Okay. I suggest that if people still have questions, and probably they will have some more, that we take it to the reception. Is that okay,
sure.
Luana? Yeah. And that we wrap it up here. So thanks a lot again, Luana, for the magnificent talk, and also thank the audience for the many very interesting questions. And we'll see each other hopefully already tomorrow, because tomorrow we have a research seminar planned with Christina Lesson-Bandera. So see you tomorrow.